The moment I saw that bright orange violation notice flapping on my front door like some kind of punishment flag, I knew my winter was about to get a whole lot more complicated. My name is Nathan Quincy, and I have lived in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision in Colorado Springs, Colorado, for exactly 3 years. The neighborhood is one of those picture-perfect planned communities with uniform mailboxes, matching exterior paint colors from an approved palette, and strict rules about everything from lawn height to holiday decorations. When I moved in, I thought the rules would be reasonable. I was wrong. The notice was dated 2 days prior, which meant it had been sitting there through a snowstorm while I was visiting my brother in Denver. I pulled it off the door and read it standing in the freezing January air. Violation notice. Excessive ice melt product application on sidewalk and driveway. Fine, $500. The unsightly white residue from ice melt products diminishes the aesthetic appeal of our community and violates Section 14.7 of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association Guidelines. I read it 3 times before the absurdity fully registered. They were fining me for putting down ice melt, for trying to keep people from slipping and breaking their necks on the ice that accumulated on my property. The white residue they mentioned was barely noticeable, just the standard calcium chloride marks that every house in a cold climate gets during winter. I went inside and immediately pulled up the HOA guidelines on my laptop. Section 14.7 was buried deep in the documents, something I had never noticed during my initial review when purchasing the house. Homeowners must maintain clear and safe walkways during winter months while minimizing visual impact of de-icing products. Excessive residue, discoloration, or product buildup may result in fines at the discretion of the board. The discretion of the board. That meant this came down to someone's personal judgment, and I had a pretty good idea whose judgment that was. Patricia Carmichael was the HOA president, a 52-year-old woman with a blonde bob that looked professionally styled every single day, and an attitude that could freeze water faster than any Colorado winter. She lived 4 houses down from me in a sprawling 2-story colonial that she and her husband had custom built when the development first broke ground. She drove a white Lexus SUV with vanity plates that read perfect, and she truly believed she was. I had first crossed paths with Patricia 6 months after moving in when she informed me that my lawn gnome was not in keeping with community standards. The gnome had been a gift from my late grandmother, a cheerful little ceramic figure holding a fishing pole. Patricia said it was tacky and cited some obscure rule about lawn ornaments. I fought that battle and lost. The gnome went into storage. Since then, Patricia had found reasons to nitpick everything about my property. My doormat was the wrong color. My newspaper delivery left papers on the driveway too long. My garbage cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though I had just brought them back from the curb 5 minutes before she drove by. This ice melt fine felt personal because it was personal. I grabbed my phone and called the HOA management office. A bored-sounding receptionist named Julie answered on the 4th ring. Meadowbrook Heights Association, how can I help you? This is Nathan Quincy from 847 Pinecrest Drive. I just received a $500 fine for ice melt on my sidewalk, and this is ridiculous. I was keeping the walkway safe. Hold please. Muzak filled my ear for 3 minutes before Julie came back. Mr. Quincy, I show the violation was filed by Board President Carmichael during her weekly neighborhood inspection. The fine is valid according to our guidelines. You can appeal at the next board meeting in 2 weeks. 2 weeks? I am supposed to just accept this for 2 weeks. Or you can pay the fine now and file for a refund if your appeal is successful. That is not happening. Julie sighed like she had this conversation 10 times a day. Then you will need to attend the meeting on January 28th at 7 p.m. The address is in your welcome packet. Have a nice day, Mr. Quincy. She hung up before I could respond. I spent the next hour researching HOA law in Colorado. What I found was not encouraging. HOAs have broad authority to create and enforce rules as long as they follow their own governing documents and state law. Fighting them typically required lawyers, and lawyers cost money. The $500 fine was steep, but probably less than legal fees would run. But this was not about the money anymore. This was about the principle. Patricia Carmichael had been making my life difficult for over 2 years, and this ice melt fine was beyond petty. It was dangerous. She was literally penalizing me for trying to prevent injuries on my property. That is when the idea started forming. If they did not want me to use ice melt, fine. I would not use ice melt. Let them deal with the consequences. I looked out my front window at the sidewalk that ran along my property. Colorado Springs winters are serious business. We get snow and ice from November through March, sometimes into April. Temperatures drop below freezing regularly. Without treatment, ice forms quickly and becomes that dangerous black ice that you cannot see until you are already falling. My sidewalk was public access, part of the neighborhood walking path that Patricia herself used for her morning power walks. She went by my house every single day at 6:30 a.m. with 2 other board members, Linda Morrison and Susan Fletcher. The 3 of them walked together like a squadron of judgment, pointing out violations as they went. I made my decision that night. No more ice melt. They wanted to fine me for preventing accidents. I would let nature take its course. The next morning, I woke up early and watched from my living room window. Sure enough, at exactly 6:28 a.m., I saw the 3 women appear at the end of the street. Patricia was in the lead wearing a purple puffer jacket and matching headband. Linda and Susan flanked her in their own winter gear, all 3 moving at that aggressive walking pace that suburban women seem to perfect. They were heading straight for my house. I had not put down any ice melt the night before, despite new snow falling and temperatures dropping to 18 degrees. The sidewalk in front of my house was covered in a pristine layer of white that concealed the ice underneath. It looked beautiful and perfectly innocent. The women approached, their voices carrying in the cold morning air even through my closed windows. I cracked the front door slightly to hear better. "I told you that new family on Elmwood was going to be trouble," Patricia was saying. "Did you see their Christmas lights? They left them up until January 10th. The guidelines clearly state all holiday decorations must be removed by January 5th. Absolutely unacceptable," Linda agreed. She was a thin woman with short gray hair and glasses that made her look like a stern librarian. "I am drafting a violation notice today. Make sure you include photos," Patricia said. "Documentation is key. That is how we got Nathan Quincy on the ice melt issue. I took 12 pictures of the residue on his sidewalk. They were almost to my property line now. I held my breath." "Speaking of Quincy," Susan said. She was the youngest of the 3, maybe 45, with dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. "Has he paid that fine yet?" "Not according to Julie," Patricia replied. "He called to complain, apparently. Can you imagine? We are trying to maintain property values, and he acts like we are the bad guys for enforcing basic standards." She stepped onto my section of sidewalk. The fall happened so fast I almost missed it. One moment, Patricia was mid-sentence, and the next her feet went out from under her like someone had yanked a rug. She went down hard, landing on her hip and shoulder with a sound I could hear from inside my house. Her scream was immediate and shrill. Linda, who had been right behind her, tried to stop but hit the same patch of ice. Her feet slid forward and she fell backward, her head smacking against the concrete with a sickening thud. Susan managed to grab a nearby mailbox post and catch herself, but not before her legs went completely out from under her. She dangled from the post for a moment before carefully lowering herself to the ground on the ice, too scared to try standing again. I waited exactly 10 seconds before opening my front door and stepping out onto my porch. I had put ice melt on the porch itself, so I was perfectly safe. "Oh my goodness, is everyone okay?" I called out, making my voice sound as concerned as possible. Patricia was on the ground clutching her hip, her face twisted in pain and rage. When she saw me, her expression somehow got even more furious. "You did this on purpose," she shrieked. "Your sidewalk is a death trap." "I stopped using ice melt because you fined me," I said calmly. Section 14.7, remember, I was just following the rules. You are supposed to keep the sidewalk safe. Linda groaned from her position on the ground. She was touching the back of her head gingerly, and I could see blood on her fingers. And I was, until I got fined $500 for doing exactly that. "I am sorry you fell, but I was complying with HOA guidelines." Susan finally found her voice from where she sat on the ice. "Somebody call 911. Linda is bleeding and Patricia cannot get up." I pulled out my phone and dialed. When the dispatcher answered, I calmly explained that 3 women had slipped on ice outside my house and needed medical attention. I gave the address and answered her questions while the 3 board members glared at me from the sidewalk. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, along with a fire truck, because that is standard procedure. Paramedics carefully made their way across the ice to treat the women. Linda had a concussion and needed to be transported to the hospital immediately. Patricia had a fractured hip. Susan had somehow escaped with just bruises and wounded pride, though the paramedics insisted on checking her thoroughly. A fire crew put down sand and salt on the sidewalk so the EMTs could work safely. One of the firefighters, a young guy with red hair, came up to my porch. "Sir, you know you are supposed to keep this sidewalk clear, right? This is a public walkway." "I am aware," I said. "I received an HOA fine for using ice melt on this exact sidewalk 3 days ago. I was told the residue violated community aesthetic standards." The firefighter blinked at me. "You got fined for de-icing your sidewalk, $500. He looked back at Patricia, who was being loaded onto a stretcher and was loudly insisting the paramedics file a report about my negligence. He shook his head. "That is insane. You are required by city ordinance to maintain safe walking surfaces. An HOA cannot override that." Apparently they tried. "You might want to talk to the city about this. Meanwhile, get some salt down before someone else gets hurt." He walked back to help his crew, leaving me standing on my porch with that information bouncing around in my brain. City ordinance required safe walkways. The HOA had fined me for following that ordinance. And now 3 board members were injured because of the conflict between those 2 requirements. This was about to get much more complicated. After the ambulances left with Patricia and Linda, Susan limped over to her car with the help of a paramedic. Before she got in, she turned back to look at me with pure venom in her eyes. "You are going to regret this, Nathan. We will make sure of it." "I followed your rules," I called back. "That is all I did." She slammed her car door and drove off. I went inside and immediately started documenting everything. I took photos of the violation notice, the sidewalk, and the orange sand the fire department had spread. I wrote down exact times and statements I had heard. If this was going to turn into a legal battle, I wanted records. My phone rang an hour later. Unknown number. Mr. Quincy, this is Richard Pemberton. I am the HOA attorney for Meadowbrook Heights. I understand there was an incident this morning involving several board members on your property. His voice was smooth and professional, the kind of lawyer voice that comes from years of practice. 3 board members slipped on ice on the public sidewalk adjacent to my property, I said carefully. I am sorry they were injured. Mr. Quincy, you are aware that homeowners are responsible for maintaining safe walkways, correct? I am also aware that I was fined $500 for using ice melt to maintain that safe walkway. I was complying with the HOA guidelines that penalize excessive de-icing product use. Silence on the other end for a moment. The HOA guideline regarding de-icing product residue is intended to address excessive or careless application, not reasonable safety measures. That is not what the violation notice said. It said I violated Section 14.7 for using ice melt, period. The fine was $500. I have the notice right here if you would like me to read it to you verbatim. More silence. Mr. Quincy, are you represented by counsel? Should I be? The board is considering filing a civil suit against you for the injuries sustained this morning. Mrs. Carmichael has a fractured hip, and Mrs. Morrison suffered a concussion. Their medical bills will be substantial. I felt my anger rising but kept my voice level. Mr. Pemberton, your HOA fined me for preventing exactly this kind of accident. I have documentation of the violation notice. I also just learned from the fire department that city ordinance requires maintained walkways, which means your HOA fine was in direct conflict with city law. If Patricia Carmichael wants to sue me, she should probably first explain why she issued a fine that forced me to violate city safety requirements. This silence was longer. I will need to review the situation further, Pemberton finally said. Do not speak to any board members directly. All communication should go through my office or the management company. He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat down heavily on my couch. This was escalating faster than I had anticipated. I had wanted to make a point about the absurdity of the fine, but I had not actually wanted anyone to get hurt. The image of Linda hitting her head kept replaying in my mind. That had sounded bad, but at the same time, what choice had they given me? They had created an impossible situation where I was damned if I did and damned if I did not. Either I paid the fine and every future fine they decided to issue, or I fought back. I had chosen to fight back. My phone rang again. This time it was my neighbor, Greg Martinez, from 2 houses down. Dude, did Patricia Carmichael really bust her hip on your sidewalk? News travels fast. Susan called everyone on the board phone tree. She is saying you deliberately created a hazard. Is that true? Greg was a decent guy, an engineer at one of the aerospace companies in Colorado Springs. He had his own issues with the HOA over a basketball hoop his kids wanted to put up. I got fined $500 for using ice melt, I explained. So I stopped using it. Then they slipped on the ice. I did not create anything. I just stopped preventing the natural ice formation that happens every winter. Greg laughed, then seemed to catch himself. Sorry, I should not laugh. People got hurt. But man, that is some poetic justice right there. Patricia has been unbearable lately. Did you know she tried to fine the Hendersons because their dog barked during the day? During the day. Dogs bark. I believe it. So what is the mood on the board right now? Chaos. Susan is trying to call an emergency meeting. Half the board thinks you are right and the ice melt fine was stupid. The other half wants your head on a pike. It is pretty divided. Which side are you on? I am not on the board, thank God. But if I was, I would be on your side. These rules have gotten out of control. Patricia runs this HOA like it is her personal fiefdom." We talked for a few more minutes before hanging up. At least I was not completely alone in this fight. The next 2 days were quiet. I salted my sidewalk thoroughly, making sure nobody else would fall. My doorbell rang constantly with neighbors stopping by, some to express support, others to gawk at the scene of the infamous incident. A few people even brought food, like someone had died. On the 3rd day, I received a letter via certified mail. It was from Richard Pemberton's law office. "Dear Mr. Quincy, this letter serves as formal notice that the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association is suspending all pending fines against your property, pending a full review of Section 14.7 and its application. Additionally, the Board of Directors has agreed to table any discussion of liability regarding the January incident until an independent investigation can be completed. You are still required to attend the scheduled January 28th board meeting to address your original violation appeal. Sincerely, Richard Pemberton, attorney at law." I read it twice. They were backing down, at least partially. The $500 fine was suspended. They were not pursuing immediate legal action. And they wanted an independent investigation, which suggested someone on the board had realized they were in a precarious legal position. That was a win, even if it was a small one. I called a lawyer anyway. Her name was Rachel Kim, and she specialized in HOA disputes. Her office was in downtown Colorado Springs, and she agreed to see me that afternoon. Rachel was in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. Her office walls were covered with framed letters and articles about HOA cases she had won. I liked her immediately. "So they fined you for preventing the exact accident that then happened when you stopped prevention," she said after I explained everything. "That is either the dumbest thing I have heard this month or the most brilliant malicious compliance I have seen. I cannot decide which. I did not want anyone to get hurt. But you knew they walked past your house every morning." "Yes," she leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Quincy, I am going to be honest with you. This is complicated. On one hand, you have a clear case that the HOA fine was unreasonable and conflicted with city ordinance. On the other hand, you knowingly allowed a hazardous condition to exist on a public walkway. That is not great for you from a liability standpoint. The firefighter said city ordinance requires maintained walkways. It does. Colorado Springs Municipal Code requires property owners to clear snow and ice from public sidewalks within 24 hours of snowfall ending. You could actually be fined by the city for not doing so. The fact that your HOA fined you for doing it creates a legal conflict, but that does not necessarily shield you from liability if someone gets injured." My stomach sank. "So I am screwed either way." "Not necessarily. The HOA created the conflict. They put you in an impossible position. A good lawyer could argue that any liability should fall on them for issuing a fine that forced you to violate city safety code. But these cases can be messy and expensive. The real question is whether the injured parties want to push this. Patricia Carmichael absolutely wants to push this. She hates me. Personal vendetta. She has been on my case since I moved in. The ice melt fine was just the latest thing." Rachel made some notes on a legal pad. "Okay, here is what we are going to do. First, you are going to attend that board meeting and formally appeal the fine. I will come with you. Second, we are going to file a complaint with the city about the HOA fine conflicting with municipal code. That puts pressure on them from another direction. Third, if anyone tries to sue you personally, We will immediately file a counterclaim against the HOA for creating the hazardous situation through their unreasonable fine. We go on offense. How much is this going to cost? My retainer is $3,000. This kind of case could run anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000 depending on how far it goes. But honestly, I do not think it will go that far. HOAs back down when you push back hard enough, especially when they are in the wrong. They are used to people just paying fines and moving on. I thought about my savings account. I thought about Patricia Carmichael's smug face every time she had handed me a violation notice over the past 2 years. I thought about the principle of the thing. Let's do it. Rachel smiled. Good, I am going to enjoy this. The next 2 weeks were tense. I kept my sidewalk obsessively clear, checking it multiple times a day and applying ice melt liberally. I documented everything with photos and notes. If anyone else slipped, it would not be because I was negligent. Patricia was released from the hospital after 3 days with a hip surgery and a long recovery ahead. Linda came home after 2 days with a concussion diagnosis and strict orders to rest. Both women were reportedly furious and demanding the HOA take action against me, but the board was fractured. Greg kept me updated through the neighborhood gossip network. Several board members were questioning Patricia's leadership and the wisdom of the ice melt fine. Others were loyal to Patricia but worried about legal exposure. The emergency meeting Susan tried to call never happened because they could not get a quorum. Meanwhile, I filed my complaint with the city. A code enforcement officer named Tom Bradley came out to inspect my property and review the HOA fine. He was a weathered guy in his 50s with a thick mustache and the patient demeanor of someone who had seen it all. "This is a new one," he said after reading Patricia's violation notice. "I have dealt with HOAs doing dumb things before, but fining someone for ice melt, that is special." "Can they do that?" I asked. "I mean legally, can an HOA fine override city safety requirements? Absolutely not. Municipal code trumps HOA rules every time. If they fined you for complying with city ordinance, that is a problem. I am going to file a report with my supervisor and probably send the HOA a letter explaining that they cannot penalize safety compliance." "Will that actually stop them?" Tom shrugged. "Depends on how stubborn they are. Some HOAs think they are above the law. Usually takes a lawsuit or two to straighten them out." He left me with a copy of his inspection report, which explicitly stated that my current sidewalk maintenance was in full compliance with city code, and that the previous HOA fine appeared to conflict with municipal requirements. It was more ammunition for Rachel. January 28th arrived cold and clear. The board meeting was held at the community clubhouse, a fancy building near the neighborhood entrance with a pool, gym, and meeting rooms. I arrived at 6:45 with Rachel, both of us dressed professionally. She wore a sharp gray suit and carried a leather briefcase that looked expensive. I had put on my best button-down shirt and slacks. The parking lot was packed. Apparently half the neighborhood wanted to see this showdown. Inside, the meeting room was set up with a long table at the front for the board members and rows of folding chairs for residents. Every seat was full, with more people standing along the walls. I recognized most of the faces from neighborhood events and casual waves while getting the mail. Everyone was staring at me as I walked in. The board table had 5 seats. Patricia was there in a wheelchair, her face drawn with pain but her eyes blazing with determination. Linda sat next to her with a large bandage visible on the back of her head beneath her hair. Susan was on Patricia's other side, looking nervous. The other 2 board members were Tom Fletcher, Susan's husband and the board treasurer, and David Chen, the secretary. Both men looked deeply uncomfortable. Patricia banged a gavel at exactly 7 p.m. The room quieted. This meeting of the Meadowbrook Heights HOA Board of Directors is now in session. We have a full agenda tonight, but first we will address the appeal of Nathan Quincy regarding his violation fine from January 15th. Mr. Quincy, you have 5 minutes to present your appeal. I stood up and Rachel stood with me. Patricia's eyes narrowed when she saw the lawyer. Madam President, I am Rachel Kim, attorney representing Mr. Quincy. I will be presenting the appeal on his behalf. Patricia's jaw tightened. This is a simple neighborhood dispute, Miss Kim. We hardly need lawyers involved. With respect, Madam President, my client was fined $500 and is now facing potential civil liability for injuries that occurred as a direct result of that fine. This is absolutely a legal matter, and I am here to ensure his rights are protected. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Rachel did not wait for Patricia to respond. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. On January 15th, Mr. Quincy received a violation notice fining him $500 for using ice melt on his sidewalk and driveway. The notice cited Section 14.7 of the HOA guidelines regarding aesthetic standards. However, what the board failed to consider is that Colorado Springs Municipal Code Section 10.2.0.040 requires property owners to clear snow and ice from public sidewalks within 24 hours of snowfall. The use of ice melt is not only allowed but essentially required to comply with this city ordinance. She handed copies of the city code to each board member. By fining Mr. Quincy for complying with city law, this board created an impossible situation. Either he violated HOA rules or he violated city law. When he chose to avoid further HOA fines by ceasing ice melt application, 3 board members were injured on the resulting ice. But that liability falls on the board, not on my client, because you created the hazardous situation through your unreasonable and legally invalid fine. Patricia's face was turning red. That is absurd. Homeowners have a responsibility to maintain safe properties. And my client was maintaining a safe property until you fined him for doing so. I have here a code enforcement report from the city stating that the HOA fine conflicts with municipal requirements. I also have documentation of similar cases in Colorado where HOAs have been held liable for issuing fines that conflict with safety regulations. Would you like me to cite those cases, or shall we move on? David Chen, the secretary, raised his hand tentatively. Can I say something? Patricia glared at him. This is not a discussion, David. We are hearing an appeal. I know, but I think we need to discuss this. I have been worried about this issue since the accident. I did not realize the fine conflicted with city code. If Rachel is right, we could be in serious legal trouble. She is not right, Patricia snapped. Nathan Quincy negligently allowed a dangerous condition to exist. He is liable for our injuries, and I intend to pursue that claim. Rachel smiled, and it was not friendly. Please do, Mrs. Carmichael. I welcome that lawsuit. In fact, I have already drafted a counterclaim that will name you personally, along with the HOA, for gross negligence in issuing a fine that violated city safety ordinances. We will argue that you recklessly endangered residents by penalizing essential safety measures. Your personal assets could be at risk, not just HOA funds. The room erupted in murmurs. Patricia looked shocked, then furious. You are threatening me. I am informing you of the legal consequences of your actions. You chose to make this adversarial, Mrs. Carmichael. My client was simply trying to keep his walkways safe until you fined him for it. Every action he took after that fine was in direct response to your unreasonable penalty. If you want to turn this into a legal battle, we are prepared. But I promise you, it will not go the way you think." Tom Fletcher cleared his throat. He was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a generally mild demeanor. "Patricia, maybe we should just drop the fine. This seems like it could get really expensive for the HOA. Our insurance might not even cover it if we are found to have violated city code." "Tom, you are supposed to be on my side," Patricia hissed. "I am on the HOA's side, which means I am on the side of not getting sued into oblivion. David is right. This is a problem." Susan spoke up, her voice shaky. "Can we take a 5-minute recess to discuss this privately?" Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but David and Tom were already standing up. The board members retreated to a side room, leaving Rachel and me standing there with the entire neighborhood watching. An older man from the back row called out. About time, someone stood up to Patricia. "She has been out of control for years." Several people nodded and murmured agreement. A woman near the front said, "I got fined for wind chimes last year." Wind chimes. They were a gift from my daughter. The room buzzed with complaints about various HOA fines and rules. It turned out I was not the only one who had issues with Patricia's leadership. I was just the first one to fight back publicly. The board returned after 10 minutes. Patricia looked furious but defeated. Tom spoke instead of her. "The board has voted to rescind Nathan Quincy's fine and to suspend Section 14.7 pending revision to clarify that safety measures are always permitted regardless of aesthetic impact. We apologize for any confusion this situation caused." Rachel nodded. "And the matter of liability for the injuries." Tom glanced at Patricia, who was staring straight ahead with her mouth in a tight line. "The board acknowledges that the fine created an ambiguous situation regarding sidewalk maintenance. We will not be pursuing any claims against Mr. Quincy related to the January incident." "I want that in writing," Rachel said. "A signed statement from the board and the HOA attorney releasing my client from all liability related to this matter." "We will have Mr. Pemberton draft something," Tom agreed. He looked exhausted, and just like that it was over. The fine was gone. The threat of lawsuit was gone. I had won. The rest of the meeting was a blur of other neighborhood business that I did not care about. Afterwards, dozens of people came up to shake my hand and thank me for standing up to Patricia. Several people asked for Rachel's card for their own HOA disputes. Patricia wheeled herself out of the meeting without saying a word to anyone, Linda pushing her wheelchair. Susan followed them looking shell-shocked. The 3 women who had been so confident and powerful that morning they slipped on my sidewalk now looked broken and defeated. I felt a moment of sympathy, but only a moment. They had brought this on themselves. Over the next few weeks, things slowly returned to normal. I kept my sidewalk meticulously maintained, using ice melt freely without fear of fines. The white residue that had bothered Patricia so much was apparently no longer an issue. But the story did not end there. About 3 weeks after the board meeting, I got a call from Tom Fletcher. He asked if he could come by my house to talk privately. I agreed, curious about what he wanted. Tom showed up that evening looking nervous. I invited him into my living room and offered coffee, which he accepted gratefully. "I am not sure how to say this," he began, "so I am just going to be direct. We are removing Patricia from the board." I blinked in surprise. "You can do that?" "With enough votes, yes. After your situation, several other homeowners came forward with complaints about Patricia's leadership. We started investigating her decisions over the past 2 years, and we found some concerning patterns. She has been issuing fines far more frequently than any previous HOA president, and a lot of them seem arbitrary or personal. Your ice melt fine was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger problem. Is this legal? I asked. I mean, can you just remove her? The HOA bylaws allow for removal of board members with a 2/3 vote of the full board, which we have. We also have the right to call for new elections if enough homeowners petition for it. We are doing both. Patricia will be off the board by next week, and we will hold new elections next month. I processed this information. Patricia Carmichael, the woman who had made my life miserable for 2 years, was being forced out. What about Linda and Susan? Linda is stepping down voluntarily. She is still recovering from her concussion and says she does not want the stress anymore. Susan is staying on the board for now, but she has been pretty quiet since the meeting. I think she realizes she backed the wrong horse. Tom took a sip of his coffee. Look, Nathan, I want to apologize. I went along with a lot of Patricia's decisions because it was easier than fighting her. She is very forceful and she tends to bulldoze over objections. But what happened to you was wrong and I should have spoken up sooner. Several of us should have. I appreciate that, I said, and I meant it. It takes courage to admit when you have been wrong. We are going to revise a lot of the HOA rules, Tom continued. Make them more reasonable. Focus on actual property maintenance and safety instead of nitpicky aesthetic stuff. It is going to take some time, but I think we can make this neighborhood better. After Tom left, I sat on my couch feeling oddly anticlimactic. I had won not just my own battle, but apparently started a larger revolution in the HOA. Patricia was out. The rules were being changed. Everything I had wanted was happening. But I still thought about that morning when 3 women slipped on the ice. The sound of Linda's head hitting the concrete. Patricia's scream of pain. I had not wanted that. I had just wanted to make a point. The moral complexity of it bothered me more than I expected. A few days later, I saw Patricia for the first time since the board meeting. She was being helped into her car by her husband, still moving carefully because of her hip. Our eyes met across the street. For a moment, I thought she might say something, but she just looked away and continued getting into the car. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Victory, yes, but also sadness that it had come to this. My phone rang later that afternoon. It was Rachel. I just heard Patricia Carmichael is off the board. Your friend Tom works fast. Apparently there were a lot of complaints. I am not surprised. HOAs attract people who like power, and power attracts people who abuse it. You did a good thing standing up to her, Nathan. A lot of your neighbors are better off because you fought back. People got hurt, though. People got hurt because Patricia Carmichael made a stupid decision to fine you for basic safety measures. That is on her, not you. You followed their rules. The consequences of those rules are their responsibility. I knew Rachel was right from a legal standpoint, but morally, it still felt complicated. February passed into March. New board elections were held and 3 new members were voted in, including Greg Martinez from down the street. The HOA hired a different management company after several residents complained about the old one being too aggressive with fines. Section 14.7 was completely rewritten to explicitly allow all safety measures regardless of aesthetic impact. I heard through the neighborhood gossip that Patricia and her husband were considering moving. Apparently, the embarrassment of being removed from the board was too much for her. I never saw her on her morning walks anymore. Linda and Susan still walked together sometimes, but they took a different route that did not pass my house. Spring arrived with the usual Colorado unpredictability. Warm days mixed with surprise snowstorms. On one of those warm days in early April, I was outside planting flowers in my front garden when a car pulled up. I did not recognize it at first, but then Linda Morrison got out. She looked different than the last time I had seen her. Softer somehow. Less angry. "Nathan, do you have a minute?" she asked. "Sure," I said, standing up and brushing dirt off my knees. Linda walked over slowly, and I noticed she still moved carefully, probably still recovering from the concussion. "I wanted to apologize," she said, "for everything. The ice melt fine was my idea originally. I mentioned to Patricia that your sidewalk had white residue, and she decided to turn it into a violation. I never thought it would blow up like this." I was surprised by her honesty. "I appreciate you telling me that. Patricia could be very convincing when she wanted something. She had a way of making you feel like you were part of an important mission, keeping the neighborhood perfect. But after I hit my head and had weeks to think about it, I realized how ridiculous we had been. You were just trying to keep people safe, and we fined you for it. Then we got hurt because of our own stupid rule. That is karma, I guess." "I never wanted anyone to get hurt," I said. "I know. I saw your face that morning when you came out of your house. You looked horrified. You immediately called 911. If you were really malicious, you would have just stayed inside." She paused. "Susan and I have been talking. We are working with the new board to change a lot of the old rules, make things more reasonable. I think you will like the new HOA better." "I hope so." Linda smiled slightly. "Anyway, I just wanted to say that. I am sorry, and thank you in a weird way. This neighborhood needed a wake-up call." She got back in her car and drove away, leaving me standing in my garden processing the conversation. It was the closest thing to closure I was going to get, I supposed. Life in Meadowbrook Heights slowly normalized over the following months. The new board was indeed more reasonable. Fines decreased dramatically. The focus shifted to actual maintenance issues rather than petty aesthetic complaints. People seemed happier overall. I heard in May that Patricia and her husband had put their house on the market. It sold quickly, a testament to the neighborhood's desirability despite the HOA drama. I never saw her again after that day helping her husband into the car. I wondered sometimes if she had learned anything from the experience, or if she was just angry about being defeated. On a warm evening in June, the HOA threw a neighborhood barbecue at the clubhouse. It was the first community event I had attended since moving in that actually felt friendly. Greg grilled burgers and hot dogs. Kids played in the pool. Adults chatted and laughed without the underlying tension that used to permeate these gatherings when Patricia was in charge. Tom Fletcher came up to me holding a beer. "You going to run for the board?" he asked. "We have an opening coming up in the fall." "Absolutely not," I said immediately. "I have had enough HOA drama to last a lifetime." Tom laughed. "Fair enough. But seriously, you changed this place for the better. People are not afraid of getting random fines anymore. They can enjoy their homes." That matters. I looked around at my neighbors enjoying the evening. Kids playing, people relaxing, the community actually feeling like a community instead of a police state. Maybe Tom was right. Maybe the whole mess had been worth it. A few weeks later, I got a check in the mail from the HOA for $500. A note from the board explained that they were refunding everyone who had been fined under the old interpretation of Section 14.7 over the past 2 years. Apparently, I was not the only one who had been penalized for using ice melt, just the first one to fight back. I deposited the check and then wrote one to Rachel Kim for her legal fees. Despite her best efforts to keep costs down, her bill was still substantial, but it was worth every penny. That summer was peaceful. I gardened. I worked. I waved to neighbors without wondering if they were judging my lawn height or mailbox cleanliness. It was what suburban life was supposed to be. In July, I was pulling weeds one Saturday morning when a moving truck pulled up to Patricia's old house. A young couple got out, probably early 30s, with 2 small kids. They looked excited and happy the way people do when starting a new chapter. The woman noticed me and waved. "Hi, we are the new neighbors. I am Jennifer, and this is my husband, Mark." "Nathan," I said, walking over to introduce myself. "Welcome to Meadowbrook Heights." "Thanks. We are so excited. The HOA seemed really reasonable when we reviewed the documents, not like some of the horror stories you hear." I smiled. "It is better now than it used to be. If you have any questions about the neighborhood, feel free to ask." We chatted for a few minutes about the community, the schools, the best places to eat in Colorado Springs. They seemed like good people. I was happy they were moving into Patricia's old house. It felt symbolic somehow, new beginning replacing old problems. As I walked back to my own house, I thought about everything that had happened over the past 6 months. The ridiculous fine, the dangerous decision to stop using ice melt, the board members slipping on the ice, the confrontation at the meeting, Patricia's removal from power, the slow healing of the community. It had been messy and complicated, and people had gotten hurt. But the neighborhood was better for it. Sometimes you have to break things before you can fix them. My phone buzzed with a text from Greg. "Beer tonight. Want to celebrate surviving our first board meeting?" "Sure," I typed back. "Your place or mine?" "Mine. Susan is bringing that potato salad everyone likes." I smiled. Susan had become much more pleasant since Patricia left. She was like a different person without that toxic influence. That evening, I walked down to Greg's house for the informal gathering. About a dozen neighbors were there, all people who had been involved in one way or another with the HOA changes. We sat on Greg's back deck drinking beer and eating Susan's surprisingly good potato salad while the sun set over the mountains. Someone proposed a toast. To Nathan, for having the guts to stand up to the HOA. Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt embarrassed but also proud. I had not set out to be a neighborhood hero. I had just been tired of being pushed around. "I am not sure I would do it again," I admitted. "The whole thing could have gone very differently." "But it did not," Greg said. "You won, we all won. That is what matters." As the evening went on and the conversation drifted to other topics, I found myself thinking about Patricia one more time. I wondered where she was now, what she was doing, whether she had found another neighborhood to control, or whether she had learned something from the experience. I decided it did not matter. Her chapter in my life was over. The HOA was under new management. The rules were reasonable. My sidewalk could be as white with ice melt residue as necessary to keep people safe, and nobody would fine me for it. That was all I had wanted from the beginning. The next winter came with heavy snows in November. The first time I spread ice melt on my sidewalk, I felt a moment of anxiety, waiting for a violation notice that would never come. But there was no notice, no fine. Just a safe walkway and neighbors who waved as they passed by without slipping. I saw Linda and Susan walking past my house one morning, carefully avoiding the exact spot where they had fallen the previous year. Susan saw me watching from the window and waved. I waved back. Tom Fletcher called in December to let me know that the HOA's insurance company had finally closed the file on the incident. No claims had been filed. No lawsuits had materialized. It was officially over. "We also got our insurance rates reduced," Tom said. "Apparently having fewer violations and complaints makes us a lower risk." "Who knew? Common sense," I suggested. "Yeah, well, common sense was in short supply around here for a while. Thanks again for shaking things up, Nathan. This place needed it." Christmas came and went. I put up lights, left them up until January 8th because I was out of town, and received no violation notice. The new HOA did not care about 2 extra days of Christmas lights. In February, almost exactly a year after the ice incident, I was sitting in my living room watching the news when a story caught my attention. A neighborhood in Denver was making headlines because a homeowner had sued their HOA over a fine for solar panels. The HOA claimed the panels violated aesthetic standards, but the homeowner argued they were protected by Colorado's Solar Rights Act. The homeowner won. The news interviewed Rachel Kim, who had apparently taken the case. She looked sharp as ever, explaining how HOAs cannot override state law any more than they can override city ordinances. I sent her a text. "Saw you on the news, still fighting the good fight." She responded a few minutes later. "Someone has to keep these HOAs in check. Your case gave me a taste for it. Thanks for that." I smiled. My battle with Patricia Carmichael had not only changed Meadowbrook Heights, but had apparently inspired Rachel to take on more HOA cases. Maybe some good had come from all of it after all. Spring arrived again, warm and beautiful. I planted more flowers, including some particularly bright pink petunias that the old HOA would have probably considered too flashy. Nobody said a word. In April, I got an invitation to a neighborhood meeting. The HOA wanted input on new community projects, including a dog park and upgraded playground equipment. It was the kind of positive, resident-focused initiative that would have been impossible under Patricia's leadership. I attended the meeting and was surprised by how collaborative it felt. The board listened to residents. Ideas were discussed and refined. Votes were taken. It was boring in the best possible way, just normal community governance without drama or power trips. Walking home that evening, I ran into Jennifer and Mark from Patricia's old house. They were out for a walk with their kids. "We love it here," Jennifer said. "Everyone is so friendly. The HOA has been really helpful with questions. This is exactly the kind of neighborhood we wanted." "That is great," I said, meaning it. Their oldest kid, maybe 5 years old, was drawing with chalk on the sidewalk. I noticed he had drawn a rainbow across the concrete in bright, messy colors. Under the old HOA, that would have been a violation. Sidewalk chalk was considered temporary graffiti. Nobody was going to fine them for it now. That is when I knew we had really changed things. Life continued in its ordinary way. I worked. I maintained my house. I waved to neighbors. The HOA became what it should have always been, a boring administrative body that maintained common areas and organized the occasional community event. In June, Tom Fletcher announced he was stepping down from the board. He had served for 5 years and wanted to spend more time with his family. Elections were held and a younger couple took over as president and vice president. They brought fresh ideas and energy. I saw Susan occasionally, usually at community events. We were never going to be friends, but we could be civil. She had learned from the experience too. 1 year became 2, then 3. The incident with the ice faded into neighborhood lore, the story that old-timers told newcomers about the time the HOA got too aggressive and learned a hard lesson. Details got exaggerated in the retelling. In some versions, I had deliberately flooded my sidewalk to create ice. In others, Patricia had broken both hips and her arm. The truth was less dramatic but more important. I never regretted standing up to that $500 fine. Not once. Not even when I thought about Linda hitting her head or Patricia's fractured hip. They had created an impossible situation, and I had found a solution. It was not my responsibility to protect them from the consequences of their own unreasonable rules. That is what I told myself anyway, on the rare occasions I still thought about it. Years passed. The neighborhood continued to thrive. Property values went up. Families moved in and out. Life went on. I heard eventually that Patricia had moved to Florida, somewhere near Tampa. Her husband had retired, and they wanted to get away from Colorado winters. I wondered if she had joined another HOA down there, whether she had learned anything or whether she was back to issuing fines for trivial violations. I hoped she had learned, but I would never know. What I did know was that Meadowbrook Heights was a better place than it had been when I first got that orange violation notice on my door. The rules were fair. The board was reasonable. People could enjoy their homes without fear of arbitrary fines. And every winter, I spread ice melt on my sidewalk without a second thought, keeping the walkway safe for everyone who passed by. Nobody ever complained about the white residue again.